In spite of your past, I know you're a good man. If you're aware of the allegations against Superman Returns director Bryan Singer and star Kevin Spacey, the opening line from the film is chilling. While we won't get into specifics, both men have been repeatedly accused of sexual misconduct, in some cases involving minors. And although neither has been convicted on criminal charges, the breadth of the accusation lends them credibility. So it appears that Spacey and Singer are, to put it very mildly, creeps. What then do we say about their role in the history of superhero cinema? For Spacey, it's not too difficult. Beyond this role as Lex Luthor in Superman Returns, we won't have to talk about him again. Singer is another story. Having directed 5 superhero films, including 4 in the X-Men franchise, 2 of which are among the most important in the history of the genre, you simply cannot tell the story of superhero cinema without talking extensively about his work. This is where we have to sidebar about separating art from the artist on our show. As human beings, it's nearly impossible to divorce our personal feelings about someone from our assessment of their work. But the point of our show, explicitly, is to provide an in-depth exploration of the history of comic book films. To do this earnestly, we can't allow our disgust at Singer and Spacey's alleged behavior to color our commentary, nor can we append each mention of their names with qualifiers like regardless of their shortcomings or in spite of these horrendous accusations. In the end, we've decided that outside of this intro, we will not spend significant time discussing the allegations against Singer, Spacey, or other actors and filmmakers accused of similar improprieties. In order to make the show we're striving for, we must do our best to keep the focus on the art and its creation, rather than the personal lives and character of those who create it. Nevertheless, we want to be explicit. To those who have suffered sexual or other forms of abuse, we extend our deepest and most sincere sympathy. On with the show. Welcome to Superhero Cinema Club, an in-depth exploration of the history of comic book movies. I'm Mark Schiff, and with me as always is the Jason to my Richard White. It's Mike Carnes.
Jason to Richard, huh? All right, so I'm gonna push a piano at you if you're not careful.
I like it. I will be very careful. I won't be menacing you with a clown tattoo on the back of my head. Don't worry about that.
You know what? Let's just go play Heart and Soul on the piano and call it even. We'll be good. So,
I love it. There we go. On today's episode, we're going to discuss the 2006 film Superman Returns, a direct sequel to the first 2 Superman movies that unsuccessfully attempted to reboot the long dormant Superman franchise for Warner Brothers. This is an interesting one, Mike. I was thinking about it. I can't really think of a whole lot of like reboot sequels where you kind of assume the canon of the previous films, but then you recast them. Interestingly, Bryan Singer was a producer on X-Men First Class, which was a prequel boot, and I guess a certain extent, X-Men Days of Future Past is somewhat of a sequel prequel boot, but in terms of taking the story of previous films and then utterly recasting, I can't think of another film like this.
there's a RoboCop Returns, I think, that kind of ignores RoboCop 2 and 3, but there's a direct sequel to 1. Other than that, the only other thing that comes to mind is something like Spider-Man No Way Home, which I know is kind of multiverse shenanigans, but Spider-Man in a way was rebooted and then also brought back amidst other series. So RoboCop and Spider-Man are the only ones that come to my mind.
Yeah, it's pretty unique. And the reason why this film was greenlit was because of Singer's work and help getting the superhero genre back on track with X-Men and X2. Spider-Man movies, obviously, also the originals really helped bring those back as well. And Warner Brothers, who was the OG studio behind comic book movies, really wanted to get back in on the action. In just a moment, we'll kind of discuss their failed attempts to reboot those movies. But it's interesting how many times now Superman has had to been rebooted over and over, including an upcoming film later this summer. Superman hadn't been on film since 1987's Superman 4, so they were eager after about 20 years to get back at it. And Superman Returns was actually quite successful. It made nearly 400 million worldwide. It was the fifth highest grossing movie in America in 2006. However, they obviously never made a sequel to it. So Mike, let's begin with this. Did Superman Returns deserve a sequel?
I was really excited for this movie when it came out. I was really excited to see at the time what Bryan Singer was going to do next. I just had watched Usual Suspects like a month prior to this movie coming out, so I was pumped and on the Bryan Singer train. This movie to me, it has a lot of great things going for it. I really think that Brandon Routh deserved a second chance as Superman. I thought he was pretty great. We'll probably talk a little bit about this later for casting, but this movie to me, it felt a lot like something, almost like something J.J. Abrams would have directed too. There's a lot of the way the camera moves and the pacing of it and everything reminded me of like early J.J. Abrams, kind of a la Star Trek 2009 a little bit. And I really think that if they had given it another opportunity and maybe put JJ at the helm with Brandon Routh coming back again and doing something like Brainiac as the villain, which we have yet to see on screen despite over 40 years of Superman cinema, I think that something like that would have been absolutely deserved for a sequel to this. So I would have been all in if something like that had come out.
Interesting. I actually disagree with that. Didn't feel this film was quite successful enough to deserve a second iteration. Interestingly, while you were speaking, I just Googled it to confirm. It's pronounced Ruth, not Routh. I know. Yeah, I know. This is shocking. It's okay. We're not going to fix it. This is
I feel
definitely one that's shocking to me as well, but I wanted to, because we're speaking his name aloud instead of reading it like we've done over the years. It is
I feel like I've
pronounced,
been pronouncing Christian Brown wrong this entire time, my whole life too, as well. So
shout out Kristen Brown. But yeah, so it's an interesting take. I will discuss the filmmaking a little bit more coming up, but I didn't feel that creatively this film was quite successful enough to deserve a sequel. And specifically, I didn't think Brandon Ruth was quite enough to fill Superman's cape. We'll get into it in a moment. Before we do that, Mike, I do want to discuss the abandoned Superman projects that were in various forms of development before Superman Returns came out. So I'm going to read extensively from Wikipedia here, and I'm going to summarize these films for you and their plots. You're going to tell me which one of these films you would have most liked to have seen. Superman 5 would have come out in the late 80s or early 90s as a direct sequel to Superman 4. In this one, the story would have had Superman dying and being resurrected in the shrunken, bottled Krypton city of Kandor. Next up, we have Superman Reborn. By this point, the producing rights had lapsed for the Salkins, who we discussed in the previous episodes. So John Peters, who was a producer on the 90s Batman films, would have been producing a script from Jonathan Lemkin, who was the writer of The Devil's Advocate, a great film. Love that one. This was 1995, and the movie was called Superman Reborn. Here's what would have happened. Lois Lane and Clark Kent would have had relationship troubles, and Superman would have had a battle with Doomsday. When Superman professes his love to Lois, his life force jumps between them just as he dies, giving Lois a virgin birth. Their child, who would have grown to adulthood in 3 weeks, then becomes the resurrected Superman and saves the world. That put them off a little bit, so they had a rewrite. In this rewrite, it would have featured Brainiac creating Doomsday, who would have been infused with kryptonite blood. In this script, Superman's romance problems with Lois Lane would have had him visiting a psychiatrist previous to his death at the hands of Doomsday. At that point, an alien named Cadmus, a victim of Brainiac, would have stolen his corpse, resurrected Superman, who would have teamed up with Cadmus to defeat Brainiac. The powerless Superman would have worn a robotic suit until his powers, which, according to the script, are a mental discipline called Thin Yar, returns. And at Peter's request, we would have seen Superman in the all black suit at the end of the script. There also would have featured Parasite and Silver Banshee as villains in this film.
So I'm going to start with Superman 5 because that immediately goes back to if he's dying and coming back in the shrunken city, that tells me that they were going to do something with Brainiac because that was his old deal was shrinking down civilizations into tiny bottles and keeping them for his own private like collection. So I think so far I'm on board with that one, but I'm not on board with this other one, Superman Reborn, where his 3 week old son immediately comes to fruition and is the somehow reincarnation of Superman again. One of the things that always kind of turns me off about these Superman movies is how much time they spend between Clark and Lois and their drama and it really just feels like the slow point of each one of these movies is the relationship drama between the two of them. So having that combined with this convoluted plot about him dying and it's Brainiac and it's Doomsday and it's Parasite and it's Silver Banshee and it's this sounds like a mess on paper.
Next up is Superman Lives. This is 1998. Now, actually, this is the one that Kevin Smith had written the script for. And in fact, they made an entire documentary in 2015 called The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. I actually haven't seen this doc, but it's available to watch if you're interested. And it sounds like it might be worth watching because this is truly a crazy story. So, again, this would have had John Peters as a producer, and he gave Kevin Smith a list of rules to follow for his script. These included he did not want Superman to fly because he argued that, quote, he would look like an overgrown Boy Scout. Peters also wanted Superman to fight a giant spider in the third act. Peters required him to write a scene involving Brainiac fighting a polar bear at the Fortress of Solitude. And the Star Wars 20th anniversary re-release in theaters prompted Peters to commission a space dog that Brainiac could present to Lex Luthor purely for merchandising appeal and toy sales. One theme consistent throughout the John Peters role in producing these Superman movies was real conscientiousness around creating toys that could then be marketed. As one of the screenwriters noted, it's cool to have a movie that makes $200 million at the box office, but what they're really after is $600 million in merchandising sales. Lastly, Peters had insisted to Kevin Smith that Brainiac have a robot assistant called L. Ron, which he described as, quote, a gay R2D2 with attitude. With these restrictions, Kevin Smith put together a script titled Superman Lives. Now, this had Brainiac sending Doomsday to kill Superman, as well as blocking out the sun to make Superman powerless. Brainiac then teams up with Lex Luthor, but Superman is resurrected by a Kryptonian robot, the Eradicator. Brainiac wishes to possess the Eradicator and its technology. Powerless, the resurrected Superman is sheathed in a robotic suit formed from the Eradicator itself until his powers return, courtesy of the sunbeams, and then he defeats Brainiac. Actually, sounds pretty sick to me. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, Eradicator Superman is that's straight out of Death and Return of Superman. He's one of the four versions that come back, and I think he can like shoot solar beams out of his hands and everything, but he ends up being the true version of Superman out of the four of them. Like there's like the Cyborg one and Superboy and the Eradicator. So I would have been okay seeing Eradicator Superman on screen. So the gay R2D2 with attitude, but you specifically said his name was L. Ron, which makes me think that the guy whose idea this was maybe a Scientologist, and he wanted to bring glory to L. Ron Hubbard in some kind of way or another.
Either that or
Um,
very anti-Scientology. One of the two. I don't know.
I suppose, yeah, one of the two. The dog thing also immediately raised my eyebrow because we're about to get Crypto this summer, the super dog on screen. Is this the version you talked about him fighting a giant spider? This is the Nicolas Cage version, correct?
Yes, that segues nicely into what happened next. So basically, Kevin Smith turns in that draft, yada, 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 doesn't work out. They get a new screenwriter and get Tim Burton attached with Nicolas Cage in the starring role. So basically, in this version of the story, Superman would have been threatened by Brainiac and Lex Luthor. They later amalgamate into Lexiac, a schizo, scary mega villain, according to the film screenwriter. Superman then would have died and later have been resurrected by the power of K, a natural force representing the spirit of Krypton, as he defeats Lexiac. They spent quite a bit of time, and actually, Tim Burton spent a year in development with this. They actually had Nick Cage in a costume. And to your point, The Flash from 2023 actually has an alternate Superman that is seen fighting a giant spider in a little nod to this film. So I like Kevin Smith's take on it. And I guess I could see kind of an interesting Brainiac Lex Luthor team up that could be kind of compelling.
My concern is that Brainiac would somehow want to delve into real estate if he merges with Lex Luthor. So,
Hey,
so who knows? I think having seen Nicolas Cage's CG version in The Flash, I'm not on board with that
yeah.
because that just looked absolutely terrible in that movie. We'll talk about that when we get to the later stages of the DC universe. Kevin Smith's version definitely sounds more interesting than this one with all the studio notes of adding in all these villains and merchandising opportunities and things like that, trying to do the whole George Lucas route of making more money on top of the film than they actually deserve.
Next up, we have Batman versus Superman, quote, Asylum, not Dawn of Justice, Asylum. In the draft of this film from 2002, it would have introduced Bruce Wayne attempting to shake off all the demons in his life after a 5 year retirement from crime fighting. Dick Grayson, Alfred, and Commissioner Gordon are all dead. Meanwhile, Clark Kent is down on his luck and in despair after his divorce from Lois Lane. Clark serves as the best man at Bruce's wedding to the beautiful and lovely Elizabeth Miller. However, after Elizabeth is killed by the Joker during their honeymoon, Bruce is forced to don the batsuit once more, tangling a plot which involves Lex Luthor, while Clark begins a romance with Lana Lang in Smallville and tries to pull Bruce back. In return, Bruce blames Clark for her death, and the two go against one another, prodded on by Lex Luthor. After Batman decides not to succumb to his rage, the two team up, stop Luthor in his mechanized suit in an incoming meteor storm. In this iteration, the studio wanted Johnny Depp as Batman and Josh Hartnett as Superman. It's interesting because a lot of these elements did actually kind of make it through eventually. I mean, I guess the teaming up to defeat Lex Luthor. I would say that maybe a motivation around blaming someone for a specific death is a little stronger than.
The two of them having their mothers that share the same first name.
To me, that was a powerful moment, Mike. I don't care what you say. Martha will always be an amazing woman, and that is such an incredible coincidence that I couldn't help but get moved to tears when they teamed up. But yeah, Batman versus Superman, Asylum.
I just want to point out this sounds like they're taking a lot of the Batman Superman Public Enemies storyline. Lex Luthor in the robotic suit, which is powered by kryptonite, something that he can use to fight Superman, trying to turn the two of them against each other. So they're trying their best to adapt a pretty popular comic in this sense, it sounds like, but Johnny Depp and Josh Hartnett, no, these are early 2000s and late 90s studio executives trying to force the popular actors of the time upon us, and neither of those guys should be playing these roles. I think so. This is a bad idea all around. It sounds like so far. I'm still on board with Superman 5, though.
Lastly, to your point about J.J. Abrams, he turned in a draft that was called Superman: Man of Steel. Now, this would have been an origin story that included Krypton being besieged by a civil war between Jor-El and his corrupt brother Kata-Zor. Before Kata-Zor sentences Jor-El to prison, Kal-El is launched to Earth to fulfill a prophecy. Adopted by Jonathan and Martha Kent, he forms a romance with Lois Lane at the Daily Planet. Lois, however, is more concerned with exposing Lex Luthor, written as a government agent obsessed with UFO phenomena. Clark then reveals himself to the world as Superman, bringing Kata-Zor's son, Ty-Zor, and three other Kryptonians to Earth. Superman is defeated and killed and visits Jor-El, who committed suicide on Krypton while in prison. In Kryptonian heaven, resurrected, Superman returns to Earth and defeats the four Kryptonians. The script ends with Superman flying off to Krypton in a spaceship. You still want J.J. Abrams to direct a Superman movie, or what?
He didn't write the screenplay. Come on, we didn't give him that credit. Did he? Did he write the screenplay?
This was his screenplay. I'm not sure if he would have directed it, but yeah, this
Oh
was J.J.
man,
Abrams'
well,
screenplay.
it's interesting because a lot of these elements do come through in Man of Steel by Zack Snyder. So there's shades of this coming through to what we actually see combined with maybe like Superman 1 and 2 together as a reboot. So I'm still kind of interested, but this script we can maybe benefit from some studio notes. So
For sure. And I think, one thing that's interesting is they all really seem focused on the resurrection of Superman and his death, which just to underscore the Jesus comparisons that we discussed in our first episode, that is obviously they're trying to make it even more explicit, it seems.
we even see that in Superman Returns. He dies in this one. There's the hospital scene where he flatlines, and it's like, how many times do I need to see Superman die only to be reborn by the power of the sun, or by the power of love, or by the power of what have you? I understand the Jesus metaphor. We don't need to see that multiple times across every Superman movie. It's not it's not part of his archetype, I feel like, for him to constantly be dying and be reborn. In fact, it's more interesting to me when he fights someone who's on an even playing field and then he finds a way to overcome without dying.
All right. Well, on that note, let's get into our first category here, The Tale of the Cape. Superman Returns was released June 28th, 2006. And as we mentioned, Mike, it was directed by Bryan Singer. So basically, really what it comes down to, Warner Brothers was like, we see what Sony's doing with the Spider-Man movies, we see what Fox is doing with the X-Men movies. We were the ones that launched this whole thing with Superman, and then we followed it up with Batman in the 90s. We want back in on that sweet, sweet action. Basically, there was some different development stuff. There was like McG and a couple other directors that they were thinking about bringing in, but ultimately they just went straight to the man himself, Bryan Singer. Now, when they hired Bryan Singer, he brought on basically his entire creative team from the X-Men films and his other films. So the writers, Michael Dougherty and Dan Harris, had worked with him on X2 and would once again reteam with Bryan Singer on X-Men Apocalypse. The cinematographer of this film, Newton Thomas Siegel, worked on basically all of the Bryan Singer films, beginning with The Usual Suspects. And an interesting note, John Ottman was both the film editor and music composer on this film. I don't really recall seeing that a whole lot where you're an editor and a composer. I know John Carpenter did a lot of the scores for his films, but yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting note. So John Ottman also worked extensively with Bryan Singer throughout his career, including on Bohemian Rhapsody, in which he won the Oscar for Best Film Editing. And Mike, that brings us to a new category. I think it's best to talk about this movie in the context of what works and what doesn't work. So for me, I feel that Bryan Singer's directing in this film is exceptional. One interesting fact I saw in my research around this was that Quentin Tarantino actually was a huge fan of this film and had promised to write a 20-page film review about Superman Returns because he loved it so much. It looks like he never actually did write that, but I will say I would have loved to have read that because I do think that Bryan Singer's directorial style in this film is excellent. I know we kicked off our initial episode and really the Superman franchise kicked off with this notion of you will believe a man can fly. I thought the flying sequences were amazing in this movie. What do you think?
I completely agree. Bryan Singer has had a long history of being an absolutely excellent director, and it definitely comes through in this movie. Like I said, after watching Usual Suspects for the first time, I was super pumped to watch Superman Returns. I couldn't be more excited for it to come out. I think that the flying in particular, it works a lot of the time. Unfortunately, 20 years later, some of the CG of where it's just like, a completely computer generated Brandon Ruth is on screen sometimes doesn't work, but they do a good job of cutting that in between actual shots of Brandon Ruth to the CG versions. This movie does a lot of things really well. The flying is definitely one of the things that works from both a well, especially if you look at comparison from the movies that had come before it and how kind of awkward sometimes it looks, or just like someone attached to wires on a blue screen, that kind of thing. So I think that this definitely works in a lot of ways.
Another element that I really like in this film is the production design. And I would say specifically, I absolutely love the Art Deco design on the Daily Planet. I feel like they really captured that setting beautifully in this film. And what's particularly clever to me about this is that it harkens back to the early days of the Superman comics when he was first created. That, of course, premiered in the late 30s when the art deco style was all the rage, and it's just a beautiful film to look at throughout. All of the production design is amazing.
I completely agree, especially the way the Daily Planet is lit. There's not a lot of natural sunlight coming through, but there you see sunlight kind of blocked by a lot of blinds and shades and things like that. And all of the designs around around the elevators and around offices and things like that, that Art Deco look that you're talking about is great. Production design, specifically with the Fortress of Solitude, I think too, is it doesn't look like a set like how it did in Superman 1 and 2. It definitely looks like it was more naturally formed out of what could be, an alien technology crystal kind of thing. It seems like when Lex is and his crew are standing in the fortress, it's like the background behind it seems to go on for a long time, and it looks way more natural than it did in the previous chronological films.
Totally agree. I love the look of the Fortress of Solitude in this. To an extent, I didn't. We'll talk about the Lex Luthor Island later, but even still, it's this ugly kind of black version of it, like a dark version of it, and the way that that shoots out is still fairly compelling. But I think this is the definitive Fortress of Solitude in all the Superman movies for sure.
I think that's kind of the point, though, is that Lex's version is a perverted or like an inversion of the Fortress of Solitude. What we see from Superman's version is much clean and pure, and then Lex's version is much more corrupted beyond that. And I thought that that was kind of the point.
Yeah, it's some symbolism there for sure. One other thing I think they really excel at in this film are the use of Superman's powers. I really like the way that his super hearing is demonstrated in that really tinny sound. He can listen through things, but it's the way it's projected to the audience is this like listening device almost, that like flat atonal. He hears it, but it's not like in stereo. I thought that was super cool to do that.
Yeah, there's a little bit of like reverb to it.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I thought the X-ray vision was also amazing. The few times it's used in this movie, I love that shot of Lois Lane going up the elevator and him looking at her longingly. I thought was really cool. And then, of course, when she's injured and he kind of gives her a full body scan to make sure all of her organs are working well. Just a really cool way to demonstrate his X-ray vision. I also thought the laser eyes and heat vision was amazing, how he uses it repeatedly in this film, particularly the scene where he saves the falling glass by kind of creating like a sheath of laser light. I guess what do you call that?
I think it's technically heat vision, and this version does an amazing revisualization of that, which is that you see the wavy lines of like what you would see on a hot summer day reflected off of the concrete. That version of the heat vision, as he's like expanding it to melt all the broken glass before it hits the people below. Or the like the first time you see it is when he does it on the space shuttle. He's trying to disassemble it there. That was absolutely brilliant. Whoever was in charge of that decision deserves an Oscar.
And then also the ice breath to stop the fires. This was used in Superman 2, obviously, as one of the many callbacks, which we'll get into in a moment. But I thought that was just another just great example. Just the way throughout the film they demonstrate his powers. I think that's not only a cool hallmark of this movie, but just Bryan Singer in general just knows really how to look at a character's power set and then find interesting scenarios in which for them to display that.
The best thing about this version of his powers, too, in my opinion, what we talked about in the previous two movies is like Superman has to have rules when it comes to what he can and can't do. And we've seen really silly things where he multiplies, cloned versions of himself around the Fortress of Solitude, or like General Zod will shoot a gun with his heat vision and it will float over to him. None of that makes any sense. Everything that happens in this movie falls within a specific set of rules, and like he can fly, he's super strong, he's weak against kryptonite, and he can shoot heat and x-ray vision out of his eyes, and that's pretty much it if you think about it. Like that's the limit of his power set, and we're just going to stick with that for this movie, and we're not going to do anything that is completely just kind of out of nowhere when it comes to what else he can and can't do from a writing perspective.
It's a great point. I also loved the Superman costume in this. It's been a minute since I've watched the Zack Snyder films, so I can't speak too much to those at this point, but to me, this is the definitive version by far. I love that it's kind of a more teal blue as opposed to the really sharp, bright blue. And the cape is almost like a maroon color a little bit. It's a different hue of red, so it's just a little bit. It's not as harsh in terms of the way it looks on Christopher Reeve in the original films. And I really like the fabric that they made his cape out of in particular. It's like a soft rubber, which is something that I guess I've never really seen and does feel genuinely not of Earth. It's clearly supple enough to move in interesting ways and move through the wind, but it looks like it's made of rubber. And I just think it looks gorgeous, and he looks amazing in the suit.
Yeah, I would say it does feel a bit heavier than it should. Because it's a rubber look, it feels like maybe this thing is almost unnecessary hanging down behind him, as opposed to like something like Batman's cape as he's riding the Bat Pod in like Dark Knight, or something like that. The one thing that I do remember about his suit when they were getting ready to release this movie is that the S logo on him is completely designed of like rubies and different jewels, basically. Like you can't, it doesn't like reflect or have like a bling effect to it on screen, but if you look closely you can see it's like individual like beads of jewels, basically, that bring make up the S on his chest.
Yeah, it's a really nice outfit. I think he looks amazing in it, and that's to me one of the best, probably the best Superman costume we've seen on screen in any iteration so far. I think another thing that deserves credit in this film is Kevin Spacey's performance as Lex Luthor. We discussed quite a bit in our last episodes Gene Hackman's take on the role. Gene Hackman tragically passed away recently since we recorded those first two podcasts, so rest in peace to Gene Hackman and his wife. It's very sad circumstances, but what a legendary actor. His take is certainly, I think, compelling and interesting, and I liked it the more I watched those films. However, there's no doubt that he, in a lot of ways, serves as comic relief in those films rather than a truly brilliant criminal mind and a menace. I think Kevin Spacey has a much darker take on this character. I think the opening scene with him taking the money from the old lady, using her hand to sign after she's died, leaving him all of her wealth. Ripping off the wig was a fun callback to the first films. The child screaming immediately and him just immediately heading off down the stairs to Kitty was just absolutely a perfect opening scene. And I think overall he does a pretty amazing job in this film.
I completely agree. And one of the things that I felt like he was doing on this rewatch was he really was trying to bring the fun of Lex Luthor that Gene Hackman brought to the role too. You mentioned the comic relief aspect of the character, which we feel more in Superman 2 because he's so outmatched by these Kryptonian villains, and that all he can really do is like try to bargain and also be witty and be likable. And that's something that Kevin Spacey, I think, is trying so hard to do, especially when he's like kryptonites on the on the continent, you know. But at the same time, he's incredibly menacing. The way that he like stabs Superman with the kryptonite shank in a way, which is a callback to when he's even talking about prison when he's on the boat with Kitty. It's like he's doing prison rules with Superman right now. Like we're even in the playing field, and you're here with me on my level, which is prison rules. So we're gonna play this my way. And that's something I kind of felt more this time on rewatch, and maybe I didn't really see 20 years ago. But yeah, absolutely, Kevin Spacey is one of the great versions of Lex Luthor that I think we've ever seen.
Yeah, I really love that sequence. I like the way the camera focuses in on a close up of Superman and he sees a bead of sweat along the side of his face. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's working. And then they know they can just start wailing on him. And the henchmen jump in and just start beating on him. And then, yeah, the shiv and then breaking off the shiv inside of him is just an extra ruthless, just really devastating blow. I thought that was just a great sequence. And it really, to your point, kind of shows, yeah, we're playing by prison rules now. And yeah, I think he gives an amazing performance in this film. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of things I really enjoyed in this, as far as performances, Jimmy Olsen, Sam Huntington plays him, I thought is so good in this. The Jimmy Olsen in the first two films doesn't really have a whole lot to do. He's kind of just an aw shucks guy, and he looks like he's about 16, which is, I think, more comic accurate. This version looks a little bit older, but I thought he did such a good job. And in the superhero worship of Superman is really funny. He actually gets off a lot of the funnier lines in this film. I thought this was definitely the best Jimmy Olsen we've seen on screen so far.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. This is the best Jimmy that I think I've seen in recent memory. I was trying to look up what else this guy's been in. The only other thing that I think I recognize him from is Detroit Rock City, which is a great, fun escapade kind of movie. But he's absolutely fantastic as Jimmy. He has some of the best lines in this movie. He completely embodies the character, and putting him in the old kind of retro costume with the bow tie amidst all these other people in like modern quote unquote 2000s era, I think is just perfect for the character. It's like he's never kind of grown out of this role as being Superman's best friend. Yeah, Sam Huntington is his name. Yeah, he's absolutely great in this role.
Lastly, I want to give a shout out to James Marsden in this film. Now, I think that like he's had a very interesting career. I actually really like him a lot, and I think he endeared himself to so many people with his role in the incredible show Jury Duty. He's just so phenomenal, so self-effacing in that. But James Marsden is an incredibly expressive actor. He has a very expressive face. He really is not afraid to go for it in a lot of roles. And I think why, in particular, he's so compelling in this film is that he's also in Bryan Singer's X-Men films as Cyclops. In those films, he has a ruby red visor covering his quite dreamy eyes, I might say. And he intentionally, I think, is very flat in those films. His character is by far, I don't want to say he's the worst, but he's no one's favorite. Let's put it that way. I think you don't really get a sense of him as being a good actor one way or another in those films. In fact, I think my takeaway at the time watching those in the early 2000s, I was kind of like, yeah, Cyclops was kind of bad in these movies. He's really acquitted himself since. He's done a lot of interesting films. I think a lot of great work over the years. And he's in somewhat of a thankless role, I suppose would be the best way to put it. But he really does bring the charm and actually plays a very competent, interesting person and someone I could see Lois Lane wanting to be with. So shout out to James Marsden in Superman Returns.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about his eyes because I've heard actors talk about that is so much of the work is that you're acting here, you're acting on the eye line, and then he's cursed with a role in X-Men that completely blocks that out. So he's kind of handicapped in that respect. I absolutely love him in Jury Duty. I think he's the highlight of that show, and the fact that he's nominated for an Emmy as just being himself is phenomenal. But yeah, it's if you're gonna cast someone to be Lois Lane's fiance who is playing second fiddle to Superman, honestly, I can't think of anyone else who might be a better fit for the role. I think James Marsden is great for that role. And I wanted to point out too, during the flashback scenes where we see young Clark Kent running through the cornfields and jumping on the water silo and things like that, I actually felt that that kid more closely resembled James Marsden than he did Brandon Ruth. So just shout out to James Marsden for taking one for the team and being second fiddle in this movie.
All right, Mike, now it's time to talk about what doesn't work, in my opinion. And I think, unfortunately, we have to start with some casting choices right at the top: Superman and Lois Lane. Now, I actually think Brandon Ruth does a pretty good job overall. I don't think that Brandon Ruth is bad per se. I think the challenge here is that they're asking him to exactly pick up the role of Christopher Reeve, and those are extremely big Superman boots to fill. There's a lot of what Christopher Reeve's charm and his sense of decency comes through, and I just get the sense in this that they cast Brandon Ruth mostly because he looks fairly similar to Christopher Reeve, as opposed to his actual capacity for showing those traits of essential goodness that you get from Superman in the first two films. I don't want to take too many points away from him because, again, I think some of that has to do with the script, but to me, he just doesn't quite work. What are your thoughts on Brandon Ruth?
Yeah, I think part of what we see with Brandon Ruth is that, like you said, he's got a lot of big boots to fill here, but he doesn't do what Christopher Reeve did in the role of Clark Kent, which we talked about before as like this Kermit the Frog kind of voice where he's like bumbling and oh, I spilled papers off the desk, oh no, kind of thing, and giving people a reason to doubt that he is Superman. Whereas in this movie, all he kind of does is stare longingly at Lois from a distance and and then run away and turn into Superman, which is fine. And like you said, he definitely looks the part as like a Christopher Reeve-esque Superman. I think to your point, it's a lot of what he has to do and a lot of the shortcomings of the character itself come from the script. And that's not his fault, which is why I advocate for a sequel for him and seeing what he could do in like a a good comparison might be like Batman Begins to Dark Knight. Like I want to see the Man of Steel like to Superman Returns and see what he could do with that character in a second attempt with a better script.
Since you brought it up, we should just go ahead and dive into the category about secret identity. It's one of my frustrations with this film. Christopher Reeve does an amazing job of playing these Superman and Clark Kent as two different characters. And in this, it's just so obvious the entire time that he's Superman. They don't really change his hair that much. He doesn't change his voice at all. And even the little kid calls out, like, oh, you're Superman. And then Lois and Richard have a whole thing of like, no way, it can't be him because he's doofing around in the other room. I just felt like this was the one movie out of the first three that I was like, oh, I'd instantly recognize him as Superman. It just didn't feel like he did a good job protecting that secret identity.
It's his eyebrows. His eyebrows are so big and bushy that you can't help but see that it's him. And I actually kind of disagree. I felt that they did do a good job of like changing his hair and kind of using product to slick it back a little bit as opposed to the forward kind of bushy look of Clark Kent. They gave him the curl and everything, the classic Superman curl. Like I thought they did a good job with his hair, but it's so obviously is Brandon Ruth in both roles. Like he's wearing glasses, he's not wearing glasses, it doesn't matter. But he doesn't have the whole like, I'm a bumbling idiot. I'm slouching, I'm hunching my shoulders over. He didn't really do all of those other things that we've talked about before that hide Superman into being Clark Kent that Christopher Reeve did, that he's not doing it in this one.
The next issue for me is Kate Bosworth as Lois Lane, and it's actually pretty similar to my complaints around Brandon Ruth, but she simply is not credible as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And I say that not because of her performance, but because of her age. Mike, Kate Bosworth was 22 years old at the time of the filming of this movie, and she basically looks it. She might look like at best 25, but given especially how the age of Lois Lane in the previous Superman films, you would think if anything, they would age the actor up to be like 30 or even in her mid 30s. Instead, she looks every bit 22 years old, which would mean she would have been 17 when Superman ostensibly left Earth to return to Krypton. I'm not saying that that's the fault of her specifically, but I think she just looks far too young to play a mom and a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist in this film. And I don't think the script really does a lot of favors for her character, doesn't really give her that kind of sharp wittedness that Margot Kidder was just so memorable for me in the first two, the empowered feminist beat that Kidder had. I just didn't really like the way that the story conceived of Lois Lane, and I didn't think that Kate Bosworth was the right choice.
This to me kind of felt a little bit like casting Katie Holmes opposite Christian Bale. You know, she felt way too young to be district attorney for Gotham City. This kind of felt the same way as, to your point, she's not only is she a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter for the Daily Planet, she's a mom. Like she's a mom of a 6 year old kid on top of that. So how old is this person supposed to be who has absolutely perfect skin and no wrinkles to her face whatsoever? I think it's wrong casting. I think that they did try their best to do a lot of things with Lois as a character of showing her being the headstrong reporter and having her, ignore her editor, ignore Perry White, the chief of the Daily Planet, and just having her go on and do exactly what she thinks is right. But completely agree. This is wrong casting for Lois Lane. We needed someone who was like in their early 30s as opposed to, being not even old enough to drink hardly. What would you say, 20 years old, 21?
She was 22 when they made this film. Speaking of young people in odd choices, I really like Cal Penn. I really enjoy him as an actor, as a screen presence. I had no idea what he's doing as a henchman for Lex Luthor in this movie. First of all, this is 2 years after Harold and Kumar, where he's displayed impeccable comic chops, really, like I said, great screen presence. What are they doing casting this guy as a heavy in Lex Luthor's? I could understand it if they were going for an Otis type situation again, where he's like kind of the comic relief or something. But he has, I believe, Mike, one line of dialogue. There might be two or three. I think at one point he says one line.
His head pops up during the scene in the model train sequence as he's putting the crystal in the water, and then he again puts the kryptonite payload into the cannon that shoots out into the ocean. No idea why they chose to put someone like him into this. Like maybe they cut a bunch of scenes out with him where, to your point, he's supposed to be kind of the Otis to him. Like we have a Miss Tessmacher, proxy. Maybe we were supposed to have an Otis proxy, but I don't know why they chose to put him in there.
It's not like he's bad per se. He's just too famous for this particular part, and that makes it very distracting. And I didn't really understand it. I thought maybe I'm like, what is his role even in Lex Luthor's crew? And at one point he flies the helicopter, so I'm like, oh, okay, he's like a helicopter pilot, like he needs that. But then Lex Luthor gets behind the helicopter and flies it himself, and it just doesn't. I feel like he won an internship somehow with like Luthor Corps, and then just showed that he was like kind of amoral, And so Lex was like, "You're coming with me. You're part of my crew now." But other than that, just really baffling casting for me there. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that I found extremely frustrating in this film is Superman's son. To me, I didn't really see the point in adding in a little kid, much less having a question around whose kid this was. It felt really distracting to me. It felt kind of pointless. When they finally do have the big reveal with the piano scene that you alluded to, I thought that was kind of dumb and kind of a convenient thing for the narrative. She needs to get out of this situation, and all of a sudden the piano hits this guy. They don't even obviously show it. Just in general, I really didn't like the idea of Superman siring a kid that he's not aware of. I did not like the addition of Superman's son to this film. I felt like that was, frankly, a kind of a contrivance and a manipulation that I didn't care for at all.
It also kind of feels like they're trying to put the responsibility onto Superman as like this is your kid and you actually need to do something with this and need to be a father to him. But then he skirts that responsibility and just goes back to being Superman after he knows at the end of the movie that this is his child and he's just going to choose to let James Marsden raise this kid, as his father, and he's just going to go back to being Superman. So I agree with the respect of like it doesn't make any sense in the long run other than just maybe sequel baits. We're putting this kid in here as a eventuality for him to become Superboy to Superman at some point. Maybe they're planning on having Brandon Ruth fight Doomsday at some point and that he would step up and be Superboy. But unfortunately, the movie didn't have a sequel and we didn't go that route. So hard to know for sure what they were planning on there. But it also doesn't pan out in any other scene. You have the piano scene where he saves her, and then they're kind of hinting at the scene where he and Lois are locked in this like kitchenette kind of room, and this kid's gonna go up and like pull the handle and pull the door off the hinges, but then it just ends up being James Marsden rescuing them. So that doesn't even pan out in the long run either. So it's like, why are we doing this? It didn't make any sense to me either, other than just possible sequel bait.
Now it's time to get into our categories of best action scene. Here's what I got for you, Mike. The airplane rescue scene at the beginning of the film, the machine gun defeat when he fights the guys that are shooting the machine gun that's going crazy, Metropolis earthquake when he catches the Daily Planet rolling off the building, the yacht rescue sequence when Lois is rescued and then it fills with water, lifting the evil Lex Luthor island, the dystopian Fortress of Solitude into the sun. I think one of the criticisms of this film overall was the lack of action, the relative lack of action compared to some of the other movies. I know Bryan Singer had expressed that there was a sequence actually of Superman returning to Krypton that was shot specifically for 3D. And because they shot it with 3D cameras, he wasn't able to use that footage and add more action to the movie. Another interesting note about this film is that there were no test screenings. He didn't actually let them do test screenings. So this actually is like kind of Bryan Singer's pure vision. But I did notice that there was somewhat of a dearth of action relative to what you might expect from a superhero movie in 2006. So those are really the only categories I have. What is your winner for best action scene?
Yeah, it takes 35 minutes for Superman to appear on screen in this movie, by the way. I just want to point that out. I was specifically looking for when he comes on screen because it did feel like a long time for action sequences to actually start happening in this movie. That being said, the airplane scene is still to this day chilling. It gives me chills down my spine to see Superman flying down underneath the nose of that plane and pushing it up and giving the people, the crowd at the baseball stadium, they all cheer and applause. Like that is absolutely masterful filmmaking. And I know one of the big criticisms of this movie was like, why does he have trouble lifting an airplane when he can lift a continent later in this movie? He can lift an island out of the ocean. And I am here, my friend, to dispel those allegations because first of all, that airplane is out of control. He's ripping the wings off this thing. He's trying to avoid collateral damage. There are people inside of it that he's trying not to give, whiplash or permanent damage to as this thing is flaming and falling out of the sky, not to mention all the people in the baseball stadium. The continent that he lifts out of that is like slow and purposeful. And if you had infinite strength like Superman did, and take your time and to push something slowly out of the atmosphere, it's not quite the same as like trying to abruptly stop something that is cataclysmically falling out of the sky. So to me, airplane scene, like I said, I watched it today as I did 20 years ago. It still gave me chills to this day. That's absolutely the winner of this movie.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, that is an amazing superhero sequence. I love when he flies to the front of the plane and pushes it back and it sends ripples across the rest of the plane. And what a brilliant device for from the screenplay. I know we've criticized the story and the script quite a bit, but if ostensibly Superman has been gone for 5 years and there's a real crisis around the world around what happened to this guy, he was our savior and he abandoned us. Now he comes back to bring Superman back by landing an airplane in the middle of a baseball field to a crowd erupting live around him. Just absolutely an incredible sequence. The whole Lois, like, you know, flying is still the safest way to travel, and then she passes out sliding down the emergency evacuation. It is brilliantly executed. Certainly the best one in this film. I also do want to give a shout out. We talked about the Metropolis earthquake, which I like quite a bit, and I especially like the idea previous to that they set him up in a literal trolley problem sequence. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this idea of the trolley problem, but he actually has to choose between saving Lois specifically or saving the entire city. And he is like, well, I got to put my feelings aside and go save Lois. So I thought that was a very, very clever bit.
I didn't think about that at the time, but now that you're saying it, that is absolutely brilliant. Looking back on it, yeah, he does choose to actually turn around and go back to help the people in Metropolis before he goes to help Lois and her son. So yeah, that's brilliant. I didn't think about that.
The other one I want to shout out, although I do think that this sequence, it's odd because it just kind of comes to an end. They don't actually really pay it off with any sort of conclusion, but the machine gun defeat, I thought was another really brilliant execution of Superman's powers and abilities. They show these guys just absolute insane machine gun from a turret shooting down on people. It's really genuinely scary. And then Superman flies up and it goes into slow-mo mode, and you actually see him flying faster than those speeding bullets and just taking all of them to the chest. He can't be shot, he's impenetrable. And even after the guy expends all of his ammunition, he pulls out a handgun and they shoots him directly in the eye. Again, what a sick shot from Bryan Singer at that point. That is the softest part on your body. I mean, I actually had to go to the doctor for getting a fingernail scratch across my eye, just barely grazing my eye. I was going to the eye doctor for like months. This dude gets shot in the straight in the eye at close range, just smushes the bullet against it. I think that's just a brilliant way to show how invincible he is. Bravo, bravo.
I didn't know you went to the eye doctor for that because I also had my cornea scratched by my dog on New Year's Eve and had to go to the emergency room at one point. Yeah, completely agree. That's a absolutely sick sequence. The one thing I'm looking through the list here and that you excluded was the sequence where Kitty is driving her car with no brakes and goes through the city of New York and is trying frantically not to crash into people. I just wanted to call that out as an action sequence because that is where we get the recreation of the iconic Action Comics #1 shot where he's lifting the car and kind of setting it down with the front end of the car first. So just shout out to that scene and to them recreating that iconic imagery.
Next category, best non-action scene. Honestly, as we've discussed, I think the action parts are the best parts of this film for sure. I've got Return to Earth and the crash in Smallville, his coming back to the Daily Planet and talking with Jimmy Olsen, the blackout sequence when Lex drops the crystals into the water and the power goes out everywhere. That is kind of cutting back and forth with him meeting Richard. We have the date night scene, call back to the first film. Definitely enjoy Lex Luthor's monologuing to Lois Lane in the yacht, and then the hospital scenes at the end. What is your favorite non-action scene, Mike?
I'm gonna go with Lex Luthor interview. I think there's a lot of things to think about and to chew about in that scene. It's not only like we're getting Lex Luthor monologuing about what his plan is and what he wants to do, but he's also getting information about why she's here and who this kid is. He's like, who is that boy's father? So it's a lot of back and forth between those two characters and a lot of information exchange, which I always like scenes like that. I think that things like the return to Earth, I have questions about that. The blackout and him putting the crystal in, I almost kind of classify as an action scene because there's a lot of like shaky cam and things being destroyed and everything in that sequence. So I don't know if I'd put it here, but I think my choice is Lex Luthor just kind of again Kevin Spacey chewing the scenery there and showing what he can do and being menacing. That's kind of my favorite non-action sequence.
I'm going to actually go with the back to work scene. I'd love to hear your questions. We'll get there, but I think that's the scene that obviously showcases the gorgeous set design of the Daily Planet that I was discussing earlier. We talked about Jimmy Olsen being a real highlight in this movie, and that's definitely his big shining moment in this film. And I think all of the Daily Planet scenes do a good job with the exposition in terms of setting up things up for the rest of the film and kind of level setting. Here's where everything's at in the story. Here's what you've missed. Kind of catching everyone up. It's an interesting casting callback that the bar that him and Jimmy go to, the bartender was the guy that played the original Jimmy Olsen back on the Superman TV show. So it's a very clever bit of stunt casting in that scene. So for me, that's the standout. But I think we both agree that really the best parts of this film are all the action sequences. So speaking of callbacks, Mike, I have a whole long list of callbacks. I think maybe we've touched on a couple of them, but there are just a lot of callbacks from the first two films, beginning with the opening credits and the main title design. Those are obviously John Williams' theme over that, and then the credits themselves are kind of updated versions of what we saw in the original Superman movies. We mentioned the ditching the wig at the very beginning opening scene of the film. I thought that was both hilarious and obviously a funny kind of riff on the Gene Hackman wearing hair throughout the Superman movies. I thought a lot of the Lois stuff was specific to the film, including her asking how to spell something. That was a clever callback. They have an awkward encounter in the lobby around the revolving door. Another explicit callback. There is a shot, I think, on the roof when he lifts off in front of Lois that's basically replicating another shot from the original Superman. I don't know if you caught this one, but in the montage of Help, when he goes around and after the machine gun sequence, they kind of talk about him helping stuff all over the world. There's a Eiffel Tower is featured in that, so it's kind of a callback to Superman 2. You just touched on the lifting the car over his head, the iconic image from Action Comics #1. I definitely enjoyed the it's a bird, it's a plane, and then Clark comes in, maybe a little corny. I don't know if you caught that he says swell at one point, and if you remember, he had been admonished by Lois in the first one that no one says swell anymore. Lois being a smoker, obviously callback. They have a flying date, which is from the first film as well. Obviously, the music cues throughout are extensive, and I thought John Ottman did a really good job of introducing some new music into this while incorporating John Williams. I thought that was an excellent addition.
Yeah, I actually thought that the original music that he wrote during the slower sequences, specifically the during the date night of them flying around the city, absolutely beautiful and was a great addition to the Superman suite. I would hire him again in a heartbeat to do another Superman movie.
There's a quick shot of him saving someone who's falling from the top of the Daily Planet building. It's obviously a callback to him saving Lois. This is a little bit of a stretch, but just vessels dangling precariously from places they shouldn't. The helicopter, obviously, being the one in Superman, the original, and in this case, it's the yacht sort of being spiked on the new island. He gives a speech to his kid at the end that is lifting dialogue from the Marlon Brando speech that's given. And the final callback, him flying into outer space as the final shot of the movie. That's the final shot of both Superman 1 and Superman 2. Those were the ones that I caught. All right, now let's talk about Lex Luthor's evil plan. Now, you kind of made a joke earlier that he's obsessed with real estate. I guess on the one hand, I can kind of see this as somewhat of a smart plan because he is displacing actual geographic locations, and then people will have no choice but to go where there is new land. On the other hand, the geography of this new continent that he's making is not exactly aesthetically pleasing. You're not going to get a lot of trees. Seems like it'd be kind of a bummer place to live, if I'm honest. Even if you kind of shave things down and, sort of terraform the landmass a little bit, I don't really feel like most people are going to want to live there. And people don't want to live there, that's just going to make the real estate value of the regular Earth go way back up. Asia's real estate value is going to go through the roof. Like Africa, I think gets maybe a little bit of it taken off. Australia is going to end up being like the best place on earth to live, and he's going to end up with like kind of condos and just not really the best people wanting to move to Lexville or whatever. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the evil plan here, Mike?
The best part about it, actually, to me this time on rewatch, was there was a one specific line where he says that he will have technology and weapons that are 1,000 years plus advanced beyond what humankind has. And that to me really stood out to me as like, okay, that's why he's doing this. It's not just about diminishing America and creating a continent that kind of springs up and overgrows beyond that, but he is going to now control the continent that is capable of creating technology or harvesting minerals that are alien to our planet and that are giving him the ability to be the most powerful person on the planet. So I didn't really pick up on that 20 years ago when I watched this movie, but now seeing it today, like that line specifically stood out to me as like, okay, he's going to control the export import of this new country that he's creating, and that's going to make him more powerful than anybody else on the planet, especially with like the army that runs out of this planet or things like that. Who knows? Like you have an entire country or continent that is made out of a kryptonite hybrid. Like you could make weaponry that every bullet that is fired has kryptonite in it, and so Superman is basically irrelevant in this new world that he's trying to create. This did work for me more than like Superman 1, where his plan is to just delete the Western seaboard and like, oh, we now have real estate opportunities. That as a way to make more money. This works better to me as like I'm going to now control the world by having a continent that is capable of giving me the technology to control everything. So I thought that that was a lot better this time than Superman 1 or 2.
Next category, collateral damage. So, what do you think the death count is this, and what are we looking at in terms of damages? Are we thinking tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, as Lex Luthor promises? Billions of people? Now, obviously, his plan doesn't come to fruition. I got my death count in the dozens. I think there was definitely some people that died during the Metropolis earthquake. We lose at least, what, three or four henchmen throughout the course of the film. So, not a particularly high death count, certainly less than the first two Superman movies, I would say. What do you got for the death count here?
I'm gonna go dozens as well. Superman does a really good job about being everywhere all at once in this movie. I think we talked about him using his heat vision to stop any falling glass. He's there. He's using his frost breath to stop all the explosions from happening. Yeah, I think maybe dozens at the most. I think there's not a lot of collateral damage in this one.
Next category, just one GIF. What would it be? For me, it's pretty clear, actually. It's Superman floating above Earth, listening into all of the different things that are happening. That shot kind of swoops around on him in slow motion. His cape is kind of gently floating in space. I think it's a beautiful shot. I loved it. That's my GIF.
That's interesting. My brain immediately went to Cal Penn shooting up into the top of the frame and kind of looking left and right in a comedic fashion. I don't know. That's where I thought it would be
That's
up.
it.
So
That's a great GIF. It's definitely usable too. I mean, you could use that in a lot of contexts, certainly more than Superman floating in space, but yeah, I don't know. I just got to go with the floating in space one. Next category, what's it really about? And Mike, I got to get a little deep with you on this one because I actually think that this movie touches on some pretty powerful themes. And I think what it's really about deep down is regret and legacy. So Superman leaves Earth. He goes to sea because apparently astronomers have discovered the remnants of Krypton and he's got to kind of double check for himself, which is definitely understandable. But a lot of things change after he's gone. And I think actually the music does a really good job of conveying some of the sadness and melancholy around this. When he goes and floats outside of Lois and Richard's home and overhears their conversation and kind of sees that they're actually in a pretty happy relationship, it seems like he's fairly heartbroken that that won't work out. I think there's a real sense of what did I do? What did I miss out on? What bad things have happened as a result of me being gone? Specifically, Lex Luthor is now out of jail and free man once again. More than legacy, which it does touch on with his child, I think really this film is pretty steeped in regret. To me, that really feels like the dominant dramatic theme of the film.
it's funny. I was thinking the exact same thing. Legacy specifically for me, with his son, with him giving the same speech that Marlon Brando gives about you're going to see my life through your eyes and your life through my eyes, and the father becomes a son, son becomes a father. That's legacy. You put that entire speech into one word, and the word is legacy. Absolutely. Regret, I can absolutely see as well. I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but I completely agree. Where he has those conversations with Lois of like maybe he didn't think about having this conversation with you. Maybe he just thought that it would be easier to spare you the pain. Maybe this, maybe that. That's regret coming through the conversation that he's having. So I completely 100% agree that those are the two major themes of this film.
All right, next category. I've got questions. Mike, let me tell you, I got a lot of questions on this one. So I'll go ahead and kick this off here. You kind of alluded to it earlier, like what is going on with him being in an asteroid again, like he was at the beginning of Superman, the movie. Now, I understand that's a long trip. He can't just fly himself. He's got to put himself into something, but like, where did this asteroid come from? How does he get out of it when he gets to Krypton? Like, is it got like a little ejection thing and then he can get out of it? And then he can't really control it enough. It just crashes back into the earth. I just got a lot of questions about what's going on with that.
My big question about that whole sequence was, does he specifically pilot the ship to land back right next to his mom's house in Smallville, Kansas, or is that just a coincidence? Like, what happens with that? Like, he's just crash lands like 100 yards away from her house, and then what does he do with the ship? It seems like he said something about he's gonna bury it, but like does we don't see that? Like the government doesn't know about this? What the hell is going on with that? I don't know.
This is a big one for me. So, this movie takes place 5 years after the events of Superman 2. Why is it not the mid 80s? Why is it all of a sudden now it's the 2000s? Shouldn't it just be the mid 80s? That was a big thing with the first two films, and I thought they did an excellent job at those films, was really capturing what life was like in the late 70s. Kind of would have liked it if this movie was like a period piece and they just thrown it back to the mid 80s. What was going on with that?
Yeah, it seems like Jimmy and Clark are the only two people that are dressing the part in that respect.
Why is Lex Luthor always surrounding himself with incompetent henchmen and even more importantly, ethical side piece women? So Miss Tessmacher completely ruins his plan by freeing Superman from the kryptonite bling chain in the first one. And then here, Kitty. Okay, what is going on? Lex intentionally cuts the brakes on your car. Okay, you didn't know, whatever. You're going to confront him about that. At that point, Kitty, get the heck out of that. Get away from that man. I just don't understand. And she's like crying when they're kicking the crap out of Superman. She shows a clear moral compass. Maybe that's kind of a theme here that women have the moral compass and the men are just after power. I'll go with that. But just seems like Lex Luthor really needs to rethink everything about who he surrounds himself with if he wants to truly take over the world.
Yeah, she is clearly conflicted. I noticed that as well. And there's the moment too when Superman appears on the continent to confront Lex, and he sees her behind him, and he's like, "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You were the lady in the car that I saved earlier in the movie." Like, yeah, it's there's a lot of questions there for sure.
I don't want to spend too much time on this one because it gets into the nitpicky and just dumb stuff. But all right, the island is partly made of kryptonite. It's clearly weakened you. You took a shiv and all that. But now you can lift it from the very bottom, where probably the source of kryptonite is most powerful, and take it all the way into outer space. Like, again, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I think that's just kind of, you got to come up with a term for like so obviously not correct that it's bad. But what's going on there? It was weird for me. It was weird.
I mean, like I said, that scene doesn't bother me as much as other people, especially comparing it to the plane crash scene of like he's struggling with, a 2,000 pound or 2,000 ton airplane as opposed to a 50,000 ton continent. It's a different kind of feat of strength to slowly push something heavier, even while you're weakened by kryptonite. It's different to do that and to like push it slowly out of the atmosphere. Like, we have to assume again, like, Superman has infinite strength, and even if he's weakened by kryptonite, I I personally feel like it's okay for him to be near kryptonite. Yes, he's been stabbed by it by the shiv, but I don't know. That scene didn't really bother me as much. Why does this movie hate dogs?
Please elaborate.
We see Clark Kent be a complete dick to his golden retriever on the farm and throw the tennis ball thousands of miles away and completely troll his dog on the farm. We see the cannibal Shih Tzu eating its counterpart, and Parker Posey's like, wasn't there two of them? And then at the end of the film, we see Kevin Spacey eyeing the dog on the island as he's getting ready to basically fillet the dog on a barbecue of his own making. Why does this movie hate dogs, Mark? I don't understand. I'm a dog lover. I'm completely against everything that happens to the dogs in this movie is completely negative, and I'm against it.
Mike, I couldn't agree more as a dog lover myself. If this had been a cat thing, I'd have been like, oh yeah, tease those cats. Go ahead. I think that is the answer to the question. Brian Singer and the scriptwriters are cat people. That's it's just that simple. That can be the only explanation for this because truly the abuse of dogs is horrendous. You got any more?
Clark Kent is gone. Clark Kent, not Superman. Clark Kent is gone for 5 years to go investigate the Krypton thing in space. He's immediately allowed to come back to his job at the Daily Planet and just assume his role as a reporter, no questions asked. Clark was gone seeing llamas, okay, but You mean to tell me that there's just availability for a reporter to step in and for him to just take, a salary role as a reporter? Like, I don't understand that. The old lady at the beginning of the film says that she has received pleasure like she's never known from Lex Luthor. What exactly is he doing to her? I don't understand that. I mean, pretty much anything that happens in this world from a pleasure standpoint, anybody has experienced at this point. So I don't know what kind of rock she's been living under.
Mike is someone who's heard those very words come from the lips of many women in my life. I'll explain it to you after the podcast.
Thank, thank you. When Clark shows up for the first time at the Daily Planet, Jimmy Olsen seems super surprised to see him. He's like, "Oh my God, Clark, it's so good to see you. I can't believe you're here." He gives him a big hug. He leaves for 30 seconds and comes back with a cake that he's baked for him that says, "Welcome home, Clark." Are you surprised to see him, or did you know he was coming and baked him a cake? For the plane space shuttle sequence, why did they choose to put every investigative reporter that was covering the story into the plane rather than just keep them into a media room so they can report on the story from a distance? I don't know of any other investigative story that would put people like not only just one reporter, but like multiple reporters and cameramen on the front line and choose to put them in this dangerous position. I thought that that was really strange. And speaking of that scene, when they're reporting on it and the news on Metropolis, like local TV, Jimmy goes to look at Clark, who's now absent, and says, "I should do something." What the hell? What are you going to do, Jimmy Olsen? You're just a cameraman
Nothing.
in a bar at that point. Yeah,
Yeah,
nothing.
nothing, Jimmy.
Nothing. That's the end of my I got question sequence. I feel like I have a lot this time, but that's what I got for us this time.
All right, I got two more for you, Mike, and these are big ones, okay? The whole reason why Lex Luthor is now a free man is because Superman wasn't there. Now, I love that he trolls him with the whole due process, Miranda rights, making your court date, because that ties back to my issues with Superman's respect for the rule of law from the first two movies. But here's what my question is, Mike. What was Lex Luthor charged with specifically? Now, I can somewhat understand he actually didn't commit a crime in the first one because he rolled back time and therefore it never happened. But in the second film, there are multiple witnesses all across the globe that see Lex Luthor aiding and abetting terrorists in their crimes against humanity. So, why do you need Superman to be the star witness against Lex Luthor? Aren't there plenty of other people that can testify and be like, oh, yeah, I was there. I saw it. What's going on there? Like, again, I think Superman doesn't respect the rule of law. I think Lex Luthor proved that in this. But more than anything, I just don't understand how Lex Luthor gets out of jail because Superman wasn't there to testify. Explain it to me.
I thought about this since our last pod, and conspiracy to commit a crime is definitely still a crime. And I will say that even if he reversed time, you could still potentially convict upon conspiracy to do so. But yeah, I really I really did appreciate the whole court aspect this time around of like he didn't give me my Miranda rights. He just dropped me off in the middle of the prison with Otis, without any kind of due process or any kind of jury of my peers or anything like that.
I think he just simply doesn't understand the American jurisprudence, much like his father didn't understand Kryptonian jurisprudence. So it's really that simple. It's just he knows a lot of stuff. He just doesn't really understand the legal system, and that's okay. This is the biggest one for me, Mike, and I feel like in the end, this really would be a question for Maury Povich himself to settle because the paternity question, it's confirmed by the events of the film that yes, this is Superman's kid. But I got a lot of questions about Lois's frankly, lack of integrity around the child's paternity to Richard, she obviously would have gotten pregnant based on the first two films at the Fortress of Solitude hookup. Okay? That's the only time they actually sleep together. That would mean that this would have to be the Richard Lester version where he wipes her memory clean. There's also the possibility they hooked up after the events of the first film. But in this film, okay, she does not remember that Clark Kent is Superman, which you would think if Superman is hooking up with Lois, she's either going to figure it out or he's going to have the integrity to be like, guess what? I got a surprise. I'm going to tell you because we're being physically intimate. I'm Superman. There's just, I got a lot of questions. I feel like Maury would be the one to sort this out. Who is the father? Mike, it looks like you can explain it for me. Please do your best because I kind of, it makes me look bad on Superman. It makes me look bad on Lois. I feel awful for Richard who's being cucked. It's just, it's just tough for everybody. It's just like this Jason has just torn their whole family apart.
I've tried really hard to think about this while I was watching it because I knew going into it that they were basing this movie off of the events of Superman 2. And so it's kind of like the Blade Runner 2049 situation where it's like, do we go off of the theatrical cut where Harrison Ford is not a replicant? Or do we go off of the final cut where he is a replicant? And so it's like, how do we determine what Lois knows or doesn't know? And I think the answer is that Lois doesn't actually know who the father is. And so when that sequence where Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor is like, who is that boy's father? She immediately says, Richard. Like, that's what she believes. Even though it's a little hesitant, she's hesitant because she doesn't maybe know what Lex is thinking. Like, she's smart enough to know, like, it's Richard, but like, what are you thinking? It like, what do you know that I don't know kind of thing. So, and then she sees, Jason push the piano and all that things that so she learns later, but that would mean that she doesn't understand or doesn't know or have the memory of her sleeping with Superman at the Fortress of Solitude in Superman 2, which is very problematic. So this whole kind of memory thing that happened, this is one of the reasons that we talk about her, like him giving her the magic kiss in Superman 2 is like, this is dumb. We don't need to do this. This is going to create more problems in the future.
A disastrous story choice for multiple generations and breaking up families. Richard doesn't know. So is she going to tell Richard now? She going to be like, Richard, if there's any doubt, right? Shouldn't she be like, Richard, I'm pregnant. Pretty sure it's yours, but I need to come clean. I did have a fling with Superman. It's possible it's his child. And then Richard goes, it's okay. I love you, Lois. I'll raise this child if it's mine. It doesn't matter if it's a half alien baby. You're the love of my life. I mean,
She may not know because of the magic kiss in the theatrical cut. She may not even have memory of sleeping with Superman because it seems like what happens in the theatrical cut is that he kisses her and her memory goes back to the beginning of Superman 2. So she has no recollection of the Kryptonians showing up, of her going to the Fortress of Solitude, any of that stuff. So from her perspective, she is just all of a sudden pregnant without having sleeping with anybody. So for her to like then get with Richard, it would only make sense for her from her perspective to be pregnant with his child.
now that we've talked extensively about this, and this is a very important moral question for me, I think the best case scenario here is that after the events of Superman 2, she has a fling with Superman. That would check out with her reaction and her love for Superman in this movie. She gets pregnant by Superman, but then Superman bails, and then because I was already kind of maybe eyeing Richard, and she's like, he's gone. I'm going to be with you. Not that she lies, but like her and Richard have a fling. So she genuinely doesn't know who the parent is. She wants to believe it's Richard's child. And only once Jason actually pushes the piano and kills the henchman does she realize that, okay, now it was Superman's kid.
Maybe so, but my impression was that after the events of Superman 2, Superman very quickly left to go investigate Krypton, and presumably she got with Richard immediately after and hooked up with him and maybe got pregnant with his baby, but she didn't know it. So I don't know, maybe that baby was a half a month early, supposedly. I don't know. There's a lot of questions in this part of the movie.
That's the big one. I just pray for those families and that they can heal their relationship. This is why I didn't want a sequel, Mike, because you would have had to tell Richard that's not your child. With that, we come to our final category, the final verdict. Mike, as you know, we grade on a scale terrible, bad, okay, good, great, or classic. Why don't you give us your final verdict on Superman Returns?
I think that things like the production and the action sequences, especially with the airplane crash, outweigh a lot of the negativity that this film may have. So I'm going to give it good overall.
Yeah, this is a really tough one. I think you're exactly right. There's the goods are really good and the bads are really bad for me. I just can't help but feel that in the end, they just neutralize each other and this is just okay. For me, I'm going to say this one is just okay. There's a lot to recommend, but there's stuff that's just stuck with me and haunted me as our paternity discussion obviously indicates. It's just okay for me, but certainly worth watching, I would say, if you're a fan of superhero films.
100% agree. This is definitely a movie more for, I think, superhero fans, especially if you're a DC fan or a fan of the older Christopher Reeve movies. There's a lot of fan service to those movies, and I think as a casual viewer, you may come into this and just be like, "No, this is trash." But if you know what's going on, you know what they're talking about, you know the references, you know the callbacks, this may be a little bit better than that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. This is definitely not a starting point movie for most people. You really should watch the first two before you watch this one. I think it really rewards seeing those. So, before we get out of here, we always like to do a recommendation of other films and art based around the directors or actors in this film. So, Mike, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I'm going to start with my comic recommendation, and we talked about it earlier. But if you can find it, or if you can go through the DC Infinite app on your iPad and get it digitally, I think that Action Comics #1 is a great reference for comic reference. That is the iconic imagery of Superman lifting the car on top. That's his first appearance that we talked about earlier. It's worth reading if you're interested in comics from any respect, because that's kind of where comics started in all respects. That's like the golden age of comics comes through #1 and has a lot of iconic imagery in it. For film recommendation, since we have Brandon Ruth in this movie, I'm gonna go to the other Brandon Ruth movie that I actually know him from, because I don't really know him from a lot of other filmography, but Scott Pilgrim versus the World, an amazing Edgar Wright comic book adaptation where Brandon Ruth plays a probably a villain for about 10 to maybe 15 minutes at the most as evil ex boyfriend #4, I think, maybe #5. He's has an incredible sequence where he shows up and plays the bass and has to have a bass battle with Scott Pilgrim. One of my favorite movies, one of my favorite comic book adaptations. I absolutely love that movie, and I think he's great in that role.
Yeah, he has the power of vegans, and then the vegan police bust him because he had his third violation.
Shout out to Thomas Jane and whoever the other guy is. I know I've seen him before, but they show up as the vegan police. I love that scene. It's amazing.
Yeah, I actually think he might be my favorite of the evil ex-boyfriends with respect to Chris Evans, future Superhero Cinema Club member. Yeah, he's hilarious in that movie in that role, and he's so smug. One of my favorite movies, Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I'm gonna pivot slightly and go with Parker Posey, who we didn't actually talk a whole lot about in this movie. I think she's fine. Doesn't have a ton to do. A little bit wasted, I would say, given her overall talents, but This is very topical, but she is amazing in the third season of The White Lotus, the HBO show. I am a big fan of this particular series. I really like the first two seasons. We're only a few episodes as we record this into the third season, but it is hot fire just as the first two were. Her character is this really rich, entitled wife. She gets off just a ton of great lines. There's a great dream sequence where she is sensing all of the catastrophe that seems to be heading towards her family, and is just an amazing actress, amazing in that role. So shout out to Parker Posey in season 3 of The White Lotus.
I absolutely love her and everything that the Spinal Tap crew does, Waiting for Guffman and A Mighty Wind and all of those. She's in all of those movies as well. She's a great comedic actress. So, yeah, shout out to her as Kitty in Superman Returns.
I just want to add, we really should mention Brandon Ruth's role in the Arrowverse series. Mike, have you watched those shows?
I've seen multiple seasons of The Flash. I have not really seen any of the crossover events. I know Brandon Ruth plays like Captain Adam, I think. Is that right?
The Atom, yes. Ray
The
Palmer, the
Atom.
Atom. Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of Green Arrow. I've seen a lot of The Flash. I haven't really seen any of the crossover stuff.
Yeah, and in the Crisis in Infinite Earths, they actually bring him back as Superman, which is kind of cool. Very clever bit of casting. But yeah, his character, the Atom, is quite different from Superman, but he's really good in that role too. That is the last we will see Brandon Ruth on film, but he obviously had a lot of success on TV. Shout out to Brandon Ruth. That brings us to the end of our episode here. This is a fun one, Mike. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's fun to jump from 1979, 1981 to 2006, and I really enjoyed having this conversation here today with a little bit more of a modern superhero film. And problematic though it may be, I really enjoyed rewatching this one.
Definitely. It was fun to jump ahead, and now we got to head back in time to 1983, I believe. Superman 3, our next episode. This is where things start to get a little bit rough for Superman. They weren't already, so looking forward to that. Thanks for tuning in to Superhero Cinema Club.
Superhero Cinema Club is hosted by Mark Schiff and me, Mike Carnes. Produced by Mark Schiff. Editing by Mike Carnes. Original music provided by Chris Carnes. Find him on Spotify. Be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us at Superhero Cinema Club, and don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a review. Join us next time as we dive into another epic adventure from the world of superhero cinema.